You might wonder if there might be circumstances where cremation might be necessary or preferable. I can think of a few, actually. Can Catholics be cremated? It's a question that comes up a lot today because cremation is a very common way now of being buried, of having one's mortal remains handled. So the short answer is yes, but there's some qualifications. In a book that we priests and deacons and bishops use for funerals, it's called the Order of the Christian Funerals, the Rite of Christian Burial. It's a ritual book that we use to perform burial rites. In the back of that book, there is a glossary, an index, and an appendix. And in the appendix, there's a section on how to handle what are called cremains. Cremains refer to ashes. After cremation, the ashes are placed in a container, typically called an urn. The cremains, the instruction tells us, are to be handled as if we were handling a casket. We would put a casket either in the ground or in a tomb above ground, like in a niche or in a slot. The cremains, similarly, should be treated in the same way. Either the cremains and the urn should be put in the ground, or they should be put in a columbarium, which is a niche specifically designated for urns. But as we know, there are two very common practices which are antithetical to the instruction. The first is the maintenance or the keeping of the ashes in an urn, let's say on a shelf or a fireplace mantle in someone's home. Another practice is the scattering of remains on, let's say, a lake or at the beach or in the woods. And then there's another practice where they will create lockets containing the ashes of the deceased person so that those lockets can be worn by their loved ones who remain. All of these practices are not in accord with the church's vision for how cremains are to be handled. Cremation, while it's generally allowed, is really only prohibited in usually one instance: if the motivation for cremation is non-Christian. In other words, if the family or of the deceased want cremation because they believe in reincarnation, then cremation is not to be done. You might wonder if there might be circumstances where cremation might be necessary or preferable. I can think of a few, actually. I once had a parishioner who died overseas, and the only economical way to get them back to the US was to have them cremated and then carried on the plane as part of someone's carry-on luggage. I know it's morbid as that may be, but that's how they got their loved one back to the United States. And there I can see cremation being justified. And again, it was really an economic decision. Or let's say someone needs to be buried in another part of the world. Maybe they're going to be reunited with their family because they were immigrants to another country and they want to be buried back with their family. Cremation, again, might be necessary or preferable. There are other circumstances. For instance, in my own family's case, we have a number of columbarium niches available for use for our family because we all want to be buried together. But because of the logistical nightmare that traffic can present in the particular city where we'll all be buried, which is in the Philippines, and the fact that we know that in that columbarium and mausoleum area, there is a mass said for all the dead every Friday by the local parish priest who comes into the crypt to say a mass for all the dead. It's expedient for us to be in a place where we will know we will have mass said for our souls. And we can all be together because land is very scarce and very expensive. And frankly, our family plot in a cemetery miles away is already full. There are other instances, for instance, in places where land is super scarce. I could think of a place like Hong Kong, where after so many years of being buried, bodies are sometimes exhumed, now skeletons, and their bones are placed in Chinese vases and stacked along the side of a mountainside. That's not an uncommon practice in certain parts of the world where land is extremely scarce, and there may be a governmental policy that requires such practices. That might be a reason why cremation could be done. Again, The only reason why cremation ought not to be done is because the reason cremation is being done is because the persons who remain, the survivors, have beliefs that are contrary to Christian faith, for instance, like reincarnation. But barring that, cremation sometimes can be preferable or even necessary. Before we continue, I'd like to invite you to collaborate with our mission here at St. Patrick's Seminary. If you'd like to make a contribution, please do so in the link below. And again, we thank you in advance for your collaboration with us in this all-important ministry. But in handling the cremains, whether it's the locket, the scattering, or it's the keeping of ashes in an urn, on a fireplace mantle, or in a shelf, or some even dignified place in the home, is not commensurate with what the church envisions how cremains are to be handled. I remember very early on as a priest, when I would take Holy Communion to our shut-ins, and these people who couldn't leave home ordinarily to go to Mass, I would discover that their deceased spouse was in an urn on a fireplace. What I would try to do is gently move the widow or the widower, that we would have an appropriate burial ceremony, either in the ground or in a columbarium, so that their spouse could finally be laid to rest. We say these words, rest in peace. Well, that doesn't really happen until the person is placed in a sacred location, which is not the fireplace mantle or the shelf in the home, but in a consecrated piece of ground in a Catholic cemetery. From time immemorial, the notion of burying persons in Catholic cemeteries, or even if they're not in Catholic cemeteries, at least in a blessed grave, this would be very much true in secular cemeteries. Certainly, I did many military funerals over the years in my past where I would just bless the plot. Nevertheless, the ground is blessed and consecrated because we believe that at the resurrection of the dead, when the Lord returns in glory to judge the living and the dead, and all the dead will be raised, that holy event should take place on sacred ground. This is why the Church insists in her wisdom that cremains are put either in a niche, in a columbarium, or in the ground buried, let's say, with caskets of the family or in other cemetery plots. This is the appropriate handling of cremains. And remember, the discipline is not just rules, but the discipline always points us to the mystery of the resurrection of the body, that this is the ultimate moment in human history and salvation, where Christ will return to judge the living and the dead. And because of the sanctified notion and sanctified nature of that event, all of these things should take place on holy ground. If you like this video and other material we provide here at St. Patrick's Seminary, please feel free to like, subscribe, and share. And as always, thanks and God bless.